So just to start off, I'm curious to hear from you guys how you ended up getting into YA novels and why you think they're so big right now. Thank you to these guys for coming out for this chat. Very excited about this. So as they kindly mentioned, I write for MTV News, and at MTV News, we usually cover music. All right. I'll tell you what the M stands for later. And despite all the twerking that goes on at MTV, I've noticed over the past couple of years, more and more people are reading YA novels, embracing YA novels, getting into them in a bigger way than ever before. So just to start off, I'm curious to hear from you guys how you ended up getting into YA novels and why you think they're so big right now.
You have the best story.
Technically, I wasn't trying to write YA when I started to write Aragon. I was trying to write the best story I could, and it just so happened that my abilities at the time and the sort of story I was trying to tell led me naturally into the YA genre. Plus, a lot of fantasy coming-of-age stories tend to be YA in general, so that's kind of where I ended up. I mean, that said, though, I think the last book in the Inheritance cycle could very easily have been shelved in the regular fantasy section of a bookstore with no trouble. It sort of bridges the gap.
I think Aragon could have too. Honestly, if you look at the history of epic fantasy, I mean, Aragon next to Sword of Shannara, next to the Belgariad, makes perfect sense. It's just kind of YA is one of these marketing distinctions, which is really interesting. As a writer, you just write, and then it's like the marketing people decide where it goes.
Well, the Belgariad would be published as YA.
It probably would be published as YA, and I bet Sword of Shannara would as well.
Wow, we can already cut the nerd vibe with a knife.
Yeah, Guess what, guys? We're nerds.
And we get paid for it.
Yeah. I don't know why we have MTV interviewing us.
Because they're nerds, too.
They're music nerds. It's okay. We accept music
What do you
nerds.
guys think of Miley Cyrus?
I'd go out with her. No.
Honestly, I'm glad I'm not in her position. Being an author is the best form of celebrity.
Oh, yeah.
You get to do this sort of thing, but 90% of the time people don't recognize you. And the pressure and attention that she's getting is ridiculous. I mean, it's amazing to me that more people don't literally go insane in that sort of a situation.
Way to work Miley in.
Yeah.
Always in the first 5 minutes.
Getting recognized is still really cool. Oh, we're checking mics.
We're checking mics.
Mic
While
check.
we're checking mics, I guess to take a little bit of a left turn from what we were just talking about, but going on this bent. So your first novel, you're in a room somewhere on a computer or a typewriter or something like that, working alone, crafting this thing, and then suddenly you're out and there's hundreds of people in a room eager to hear about your books. What's that experience like?
I know for me it's, I kind of tying into your first question, to me the most magical time for me for reading was definitely middle school and high school. And we didn't really have a YA section back then. Stephen King was my YA section. And also a lot of the big, thick fantasy novels and stuff. So I don't really think about what age I'm writing for. I just write what I think's cool. But it definitely seems to fit in that market. But it never gets old, at least for me. Just that people are actually reading my stuff and enjoying it. It's just extremely rewarding. I love it.
You know, when I was a teenager, I volunteered at a library. Nerd. And I remember, we didn't have the YA section back then. At least it hadn't hit Nebraska yet. Maybe the fancy places like, New York had one, but we didn't. And I remember working there, and when they got out the Anne McCaffrey books, they had me go shelve them in the children's section. I'm like, Anne McCaffrey is not a children's author. Anne McCaffrey is real science fiction. It's not even fantasy, it's science fiction. And I was all uppity about it, but the reason the librarian says, this is what the teenagers want to read, and this is where they go. And I love, despite kind of sounding maybe down on it a little bit earlier, I love the idea of the YA section, because the whole idea for the YA section was to create a safe haven for the teen readers, or those who didn't want to go in the children's section, but at the same time might be intimidated by the big thick books in the adult fantasy and epic section, or some of the other adult sections. You've got this kind of nice safe haven where I think that if I would have had that as a teen reader, it would have been a bit easier for me to get into reading. My very first, someone handed me Tolkien when I was very young. And Tolkien, I was a reluctant reader. I didn't read a lot when I was a kid, unlike a lot of writers. And Tolkien just scared me. I started reading him, and I just couldn't do it. It was too above me. It's fantastic. I've since read it, but it just scared me off. And a lot of writing scared me off. And if I'd had this sort of thing where people could have instead said, here is the Maze Runner, here is Aragon, here is something that is exciting and fun, but also a little bit challenging to get me reading, I think it would have worked much better for me.
And it certainly saves time having to hunt around the shelves for that one thing that's going to work for your age rather than Dostoevsky necessarily. I mean, the problem with YA, though, it is an artificial thing in many ways, because technically you can have a book, you can write a book with all of the rape and murder and violence and sex that you want, and as long as the main characters are under 18, it is technically a YA or even children's book.
Yeah.
And as soon as the main character is 18 or older, doesn't matter how innocent or cheery or benign the story is, it is technically no longer a YA book. And in some ways that frustrates me, because I know how to write a story with, say, a 20-year-old main character that is a YA book and would be enjoyed by a YA audience. And in fact, some of the Heinlein juveniles would probably fall into that, like Starman Jones or something. But it's a marketing thing, and so it's difficult if you're doing something that, like a border case like that, in finding the audience you want.
I know, like the Golden Compass, for those reasons, was very hard to put in bookstores, because how old is Lyra in that? She's not very old. It's like
10 or 12.
It's like it's a teen book, but she's like young middle grade age, and yet it's also they printed lots of different copies and put it in different places in the bookstore to see where it would take off. Because that whole adage of the age of the protagonist -2 is generally the age that the reader is supposed to be for, but
and
that's
course,
artificial.
As a young reader, you don't want to read a kid's book. You want to read, adult books.
That's why, Anne McCaffrey, I'm reading real serious fiction.
Easily, at least half of my readers' audience are adults. I just think that's why the YA market is so incredibly hot right now.
Well, I think part of that is because a lot of YA deals with the process of adolescence, of growing up, going from child to adult, and unless you die early, that's something everyone goes through, or you're about to go through it, or you've gone through it, and
I don't know. Have you become an adult yet?
I'm waiting.
I think the goatee gives it away.
This was my attempt to try to be an adult.
But the thing is that it's growing up as a transformative experience, physically and mentally, and it's something that everyone can relate to. And I think that's why YA fiction especially can be appreciated by an 8-year-old and a 28-year-old.
But really, when it comes down to it, we're just writing what we think's really cool.
Yeah.
I mean, when I write, some cases you pitch it one way, some cases you pitch it the other way. Like I've written middle grade YA and adult, and the process for that is not much different from one another. Now I do consider audience when I'm writing a book, but at the end of the day, I'm writing something that I think is awesome, and then I'll be to the editor, say, you probably want to sell this YA.
I mean, when I sit down to write, I'm trying to recreate the sense of awe and awesomeness that I experience as a reader when I read a great book. The problem is I found that the more I've written and the more I've read, it's becoming harder and harder for me to find books that give me that feeling, which is sometimes why I'll go back and reread books that I read 10 years ago, because those are the ones that had that effect on me.
I just reread The Shining right before I read Doctor Sleep. Anyone read those? They're awesome. Total tangent, sorry.
Stephen King is fantastic.
So does that help with your mindset going into writing your next book?
Yeah, I actually like to be reading the Stephen King book when I'm writing my first draft, because he's my idol. He really helps me with my writing.
One of the things I think he does best is he has that storyteller's voice.
Right.
It doesn't matter what he's talking about. It's, here, let old Steve, sit you down and tell you a story, and he can go on and on and on about things that maybe don't even matter to the story, but he's so assured of the music of the words, you can't just help just listening to that and getting carried along with it.
For Christopher and Brandon, do you have anybody like that you go back and constantly reread to remind yourself of the basics?
I read a lot. Now, this is going to sound like the obvious answer, but Robert Jordan. When I was growing up,
you had to.
I had to, but when I was growing up, The Wheel of Time was kind of my idol. This is the thing I wanted to be. And when I decided I wanted to be a writer, no one really could tell me how to be a writer. Like the writing classes, particularly in high school, are not very useful for being a writer. And even in college, I mean, they're great for teaching you the basics, but the problem is if you want the master level writing course, you have to go to people who are themselves master level writers. And English teachers who are fantastic, they're good at teaching, but if they don't know the writing, they can get you excited about it, but they can't teach you to write. In fact, even in college, it's really hard. I teach a college course. You can't really teach people to write. You just can't. You can teach people the tools that some writers use, but it's a little bit like handing them, like try this screwdriver, see if this works in the thing you're trying to build. Okay, that doesn't. Here, try this this wrench. And if you really want to learn how to write, you've got to practice and you've got to read great writers and try and learn from what they're doing. And I would go back time and time again to the Wheel of Time saying, how is this guy doing viewpoint? Because Robert Jordan's use of viewpoint is my favorite part of his books. And I would say he was the biggest influence on me growing up as a writer. Not even now, which is pretty obvious, but growing up as a writer.
Well, I like what Stephen King, sorry to keep bringing him up,
Yeah.
said, you can help teach at least a good writer to become a great writer, but you cannot teach a bad writer to become a good writer.
Okay.
So you do have to have some sort of natural instinct for it, and then you can start developing it.
And then there are people like Robert E. Howard who are both bad writers and good writers at the same time. I mean, for me, it's a lot of the books that I read growing up that influenced me a lot. Probably the Gormenghast trilogy by Mervyn Peake, The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison, both of which have incredible use of language, which I find interesting. Stephen King, because he's so good at that voice. Dune. I wouldn't want to read. I've probably read Dune more than any other book. I wouldn't want to write like Frank Herbert, but he does some really strange things with the language, and he makes them work. The Mabinogion Tetralogy by Evangeline Walton, and the Wizard of Earthsea trilogy by Ursula Le Guin, because she tells more than she shows compared with a lot of modern authors, and I just find a lot of her work inspiring. So it's just anything with interesting use of the language that I can look at and say, this is a different way of doing something that maybe I've been grappling with, and maybe that'll give me another tool to use to tackle this problem.
I kept waiting for the Super Fudge series.
I think this is something we touched on a little bit before, but I wanted to explore further. How do you guys craft protagonists? And do you start with them, or do you start with the plot first and then figure out the character from there?
That's a really good question.
I can tackle this one first, give the other guys some time to talk, or to think. Because I've answered this question a lot because I teach writing, and I've kind of formulated how, it's very interesting. I wear one hat as an academic, right? I teach at the university, I have a master's degree in English, and then I wear another hat as the writer. And the academic and the writer don't interact as much as you would think they do. Because writing is an art, and part of it is so instinctive that you have to, it's more like you've trained yourself with these quote-unquote muscles to use. And when you go into it, it's almost like writing a book is almost a performance art, in that I go and I perform for several hours. And then I get done, and then I can hand it over to the academic and say, what do you think of this? What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? The academic has a lot more to do with editing. And the academic also observes my process and then learns to talk about it. And I've learned that for me, character is one of these things that I can't plan out too much ahead of time. Writers tend to fall into two camps. They tend to be, as George R. R. Martin calls them, architects or gardeners. Gardeners nurture a story. Stephen King is a gardener. Start with just some sort of idea and then see where it goes. And architects build an outline. And I architect my plots. I build an outline. I build a world. My framework for my worlds, my world building, and something like Steelheart, I'll spend a lot of time saying, what's the visual sense of this world? What's the underlying mechanics of what is making people become these epics? What is, where does this all come from? And build this all into a document, what the world feels like, what different cities feel like, and things like this.
That's your Penny Arcade.
Yes, that's my Penny Arcade thing. Which you haven't seen. They did a comic on me that talks about this. But anyway, I do all of that. But then the person I place in this world, I found that if I put too much structure for that personality, the entire book feels wooden. It feels like this thing that I've I've created that the character just has to mechanically move through and therefore can't be alive. And I found that in order to add a sense of spontaneity and life to my fiction, I have to let the character develop naturally. I have to say, all right, here is all of this stuff, and put the character into it, and then see if they follow the plot. And if they don't, I will rebuild my outline to fit what this character's doing. And so, yes and no. I often will have a conflict for a character that I'm putting them in, but I don't know who they are until I write the first scene. And that usually requires me to write 3 or 4 different scenes and throw each of them away until I capture the right voice, like I'm casting different people in the role.
Yeah.
To use a very specific example, there was the annotated version, I think, of Steelheart. You talk about the main character, one of the main facets is he has terrible metaphors.
Yes, the bad
but
metaphors.
I believe you didn't even discover that until you made a terrible metaphor in
Right.
the first chapter.
Yeah. It was. I don't even think it was first chapter. It might have been second. I might have re-added in them earlier on. But yeah, I'm writing along. I'm like, who is this guy? This feels bland. Who is he? What is he passionate about? What goofy things does he do? And then I was trying to come up with a metaphor, and I wrote one. It was bad. Like, it was just terrible. And I'm like, oh, I can't use that. And usually you have to go through like 6 or 7. But I'm like, this is just a majestically bad metaphor. And for the rest of the book, I'm like, this is it. This is him. He wants so hard to do things the right way that he goes too far and tries too hard, and they come out wrong. And I'll tell you guys, writing bad metaphors that are good bad metaphors is really hard. Because to make them work, it was a real challenge. It became the hardest aspect of the book in some ways, coming up with his metaphors, which are supposed to be bad.
I think a lot of this with the protagonist depends on where you're starting in terms of creating the story to begin with. Because sometimes you get an idea for a character, and the character is what drives your interest in creating a story for that character. Whether it's you see a painting or a picture or something, and I've had this happen, where I see a painting or a picture, and it strikes me so strongly that it's like, I want to know this person. I want to create a character for this image. And what sort of a world or story would support this character? Other times, I'll get an idea that's an image or a feeling, and then that's the kernel of the story, and then everything else, including the characters, is built to support that core idea. For example, with Aragon, it was a young man finds a dragon egg out in the middle of the forest. Well, who finds it? Why is he out there? Where did the dragon egg come from? And so forth. A lot of times you hear about this division between genre fiction, which is story-driven, and literary fiction, which is character-driven. And sure, you can have a story that is more character-driven or more story-driven, but if you're honest with yourself and with your story as a writer, the things that happen to your characters will change who the character is, and who your characters are will change the story itself. And to me, it's a mixture. I plot things out, I outline, and I usually stick to that fairly closely. But at the same time, you have to be open to who the characters are and who they've become over the course of the series, the course of the story, or you end up forcing them to do things that they wouldn't necessarily do. And in fact, in my own books, in my last book, the fates of the main 4 or 5 characters were all changed from my original outline, because I realized that they themselves had changed, and if I made them do what I'd originally planned, it would feel wrong.
I really hate going after you guys. I definitely think for me it's an organic thing where I'm bouncing, the world influences the character so much, and the character, it adapts to the world so much. So a lot of times I'm working back and forth. The Maze Runner series was a real challenge. I didn't realize how much you relied on someone's memories and events through their life to develop them as a character. And so Thomas had his memory wiped, and suddenly how am I going to develop this guy? He can't remember anything. He can't draw back on terrible experiences in his childhood. That was a real challenge for me, but just kept kind of working back and forth between him and this terrible environment that he'd been thrown into, and they just organically. I don't do a lot of outlining. I'm more of the Stephen King type, I guess. Yeah. That's the only way I'm like Stephen King.
No, you kill people and stick them in your
basement.
basement.
I do kill people.
I have to get used to that. I'm not quite used to killing characters yet.
It's really fun. You should try it.
I'll work on it. But I agree, though, that having a scene where you think you know what the character is, and then you start writing the character and hearing how they actually speak and seeing how they actually behave. I've had it happen more than one time where that changes my conception of who the character is, and then changes the outline of the story as a result. So.
You got to be a little cuckoo to be an author.
Oh yeah, you know. I love the T-shirt I saw someone wearing that said, "You're just jealous because the voices speak to me." And that's pretty much what being an author's like.
So all of you have embraced multiple series at this point. I believe with Aragon, you already had a couple planned out when you started the first book, or at least at some point there. And both Eye of the Mines and Steelheart plug the next books in the series and the books themselves. So why series? Why not standalone? Why have it go over multiple books? What's appealing about that to you?
Because it allows you to build depth, richness, and complexity that would otherwise be impossible. Because I'm guessing we all grew up reading large series as well, and so when I was a kid, you know, a fantasy series has to be 3 books or it's not proper, it's not right. At least 3 books. And because, at least in my own case, I'm very, very wordy and I have a lot of things to say, and if I tried to cram it all into one novel, my editor would kill me. And the publisher and the printer would kill me as well, so.
Yeah, I think it's just very appealing. It seems especially prevalent in fantasy and science fiction, but I know you get so invested in these characters in this world, it's just a lot of fun to have another one.
And if you spend all the time building an imaginary world, which takes a lot of work, to do that for only 1 book, I mean, you can do that, but it almost seems like a waste of effort to do it just for 1 novel.
I've done that twice. And yes, I have this, I like standalones. I like standalone epics. Things like Guy Gavriel Kay's work in epic fantasy as a standalone is really a strength of the genre that you can do that sometimes. But at the same time, I grew up reading Robert Jordan. I grew up reading Melanie Ron's books, which I love, and things like this. And I have this theory, the academic coming out, talks about the idea of science fiction fantasy has what we call a steep learning curve. When you as a reader go to these books and start reading them, there is a certain level of you have to work to understand it. You have to memorize all these names.
It's like Russian literature.
Yeah, it is. You have it's a big effort, and by the time you get done with that book, you've become an expert in this, and you want to use your expertise. I feel like in fantasy and science fiction, this is one of the reasons why we see so many series, is because the fans really like them, because when you work your way through one of these, and by the end you know all of this stuff, the sequel then, you can use that expertise and enjoy reading the book without quite having to work quite so hard.
Yeah.
I mean, we like working hard, that's why we read these genres, but we also like using what we know. If you've known any kind of nerdier people, you may know that they like to talk about the things that they've become experts in. And we enjoy that. It's a natural human expression.
But the tricky thing as a writer is, and as a reader, I think, is it's important for the series to have an ending.
It is.
Because I got frustrated as a reader in my teens that some series, which shall remain unnamed, had no endings. And I'm sorry, but personally, I don't think a story can be judged as not only complete, but I don't think you can judge it if it's any good if it doesn't actually have an ending. Or it may be good, but compared to the story that does have an ending, it will always be on a lower step, which is why I hope George R.R. Martin hurries up and finishes the next few books.
If there are kids in the audience, don't read those yet.
Yes, don't.
But there's teen characters, so it's technically YA fiction.
Oh,
Right?
Yeah.
marketed as YA.
Don't read the books, but the TV show's fine.
I think that's probably a pretty good transition to talk about movies, because you all have had very different experiences with them. You've had one made, you have one in progress. I know from reading the back matter, you have one that you're kind of working on.
5.
5? Well, what's your experience been with movies, and what can you tell us about either the past or what's coming up?
Well, I'm very happy that a film was made, because very few books are ever actually adapted into films, and the movie version of Aragon introduced a lot of new readers to the series, which, as an author, I think is fantastic. I offered as much input as I could into the making of the film, but ultimately the movie reflected the director and the studio's vision of the story, just as the books reflect my vision of the story. And the great thing about different versions is that everyone is free to enjoy them on their own terms. ultimately, I would love to see, a continuation of the film franchise or a rebooting of the first film, but
Look
well,
how
they'd have
political
to at
he
this-
is.
He's so diplomatic.
Wow.
They'd have to at this point because everyone's out, no longer under contract for that. So the thing is, though, is it's ultimately out of my hands. That is up to the people with $200 million to throw around. So the best thing I can do is keep telling stories and telling them as best as I can. But I have to say, it was incredibly surreal to be sitting in a movie theater with Robert Carlyle directly next to me, watching him up on screen performing as a character I wrote when I was 15, 16, saying lines that I wrote when I was 15, 16. And then it was even more surreal to play the video game version of the film based on the book I wrote. That was like being trapped in this weird recursive dream where everything was similar but not quite right. And so it was quite an experience.
For me, my experience so far has been just unbelievably positive. I mean, I had high expectations, and so far they've exceeded them. Of course, the movie has not come out yet. It comes out September 19th next year. But, I was very happily involved. I didn't really have to be contractually, but Fox wanted me involved. So feedback on the script, I went to the set twice, I met all the cast, constant contact with the director, and I even have a cameo. And I've seen early footage, and so far it is just exceeding my most outrageous, highest expectations. So I think it's going to be awesome, and we'll see how it does when it comes out.
Awesome.
So I've been involved in 5 film projects, and Hollywood is Hollywood.
Yeah.
You guys actually got something made. You are so lucky.
Don't worry, you write so many books, it's
Right,
gonna happen.
right, yeah, sure.
One way or another.
So I've licensed Steelheart, The Emperor's Soul, Mistborn, and Legion, and Alcatraz, and have been loosely involved in the Wheel of Time adaptation. And every one of those is trapped in some form of development. Heck, there's children here, right?
Well, I want to see the tight, short, tense version, 80-minute version of the Way of Kings.
Yeah. I have had inquiries about it, and I haven't sold it because I'm not far enough along in the series. So, Hollywood is an interesting place. You have a lot of really passionate people who really love what they do, and none of them have any money. And so then you have a lot of people who have money, and these people want to make a return on their investment.
Yeah.
And the films that you get are a meeting of minds between the passionate, excited, want to make awesome stuff people, convincing the people who have the money that what they're passionate and excited about will actually make money. And sometimes this works, and sometimes it doesn't.
I was actually going to have a cameo in the Aragon film, but I was touring for the second book, Eldest, at the time, so the timing didn't work out. But I'd asked for this, and they agreed. They were going to fly me out to Budapest, where they were filming, and I was going to appear in the final battle of the film, dressed up as one of the monsters, one of the Urgals, and I was going to get my head chopped off on screen by Aragon.
You got to go to Budapest. I went to Louisiana.
I'm still sad that didn't happen, so I got to get another film made so I can get decapitated on screen.
By the way, I wasn't supposed to say I have a cameo. For some reason, Fox didn't want me to, so this is a real bad place to say that.
Okay, so none of them have phones or
Right.
anything.
Yeah, no
It's not
tweeting or anything, right?
It's not being live streamed or anything like that, so we're all good. Before we're going to get to some reading from you guys in a second, and then some of your questions. But before we move forward, I was curious, what are you guys working on right now? Christopher.
You're the one we need to know the most.
Oh, boy. Lots of top secret things I can't talk about, or I'd have to lock you in my basement for the next few years, which you all seem like lovely people, but
They're
I
all
don't
raising
think,
their hand. They like that idea.
I don't think my family wants to have to cook for you for the next 3 years. I just finished a project, actually, which I can't say too much about, but I'm very pleased with, and I've got a few other things that are in the works. I've been writing very hard and very fast, and hopefully I'll be able to show some of that to the world in short order. At the moment, I'm working on some science fiction with lots of aliens and lasers and explosions and spaceships, so lots of fun. Long term, I do plan on returning to the world of Aragon and writing book 5. So one of these days. I mean, as you know, I left lots of questions unanswered in the last book, so I did that on purpose because the world goes on and the story goes on. But I spent 10 years working on the series, and I need a break. So first things first.
I just finished the sequel to my new book, The Eye of Minds, and right now I'm kind of brainstorming with some ideas. You know, speaking of the standalone thing, I have always wanted to do a couple of solid standalones, more in the Stephen King horror genre. I'm kind of brainstorming in that area.
I am hard at work on 2 novels right now. The first is called Words of Radiance, which is a sequel to The Way of Kings.
You have to send that to me.
Yes, I know. I will be sending it to you very soon. It is almost done. I'm doing a last revision right now. I've only added 3 scenes so far, so I'm doing pretty well. It is big. It's a very big book. And I've written about half of Firefight, which is the sequel to Steelheart, which should come out next year, fall. So sequel to Way of Kings is going to be the spring, and then Firefight will be the fall. I've written actually a short story in World of Steelheart, which we will be releasing fairly soon. They haven't told me when they're releasing it, so that'll be very fun. So look for those coming up. Hopefully you will enjoy them. I actually have one of the artists who's working on some stuff for Way of Kings here today. I had lunch with him, and so we're gonna have some really awesome art in Words of Radiance. It's gonna blow you away.
So Brandon and I basically live down the road from each other.
Yeah.
And it always boggles my mind that, so The Way of Kings, which is one book, is longer than my entire Maze Runner series.
Yeah, on behalf of authors everywhere, how? Can you outsource your brain?
You never get bored. I mean, he's very good at what he does.
Yes, I highly recommend The Way of Kings. I enjoyed it immensely.
I like what big epic fantasy can do,
Yeah.
and I like to show off what the genre is capable of doing. And that is what I'm doing with The Way of Kings, is me trying to say, look, this is what epic fantasy can possibly do.
You know, and it's a whole other conversation for another time, but it would be interesting to talk about the differences in prose style among the big epic fantasies, because you're doing one very specific thing.
I am.
Tolkien is a whole other ball of wax.
Well, and I've been reading a lot of Jim Butcher and he's great, and a lot of Brent Weeks lately, and they have a certain style, both of them in their epic fantasies. It's very interesting. They're actually paced a lot like a lot of the YA books I'm reading, the pacing, as well as but they're moving it into the epic fantasy realm, which is
Did you read any of Joe Abercrombie?
I've read a little of Joe Abercrombie, not as much as I should have, but it's very interesting what's happening just in fiction right now. I've been reading a lot of YA lately as well, trying to just. I read a new book by. Do you guys know April Lynn Pike? You ever heard of her? Fantastic writer. I just read her new book and things like this, and just learning what the genres are doing. I love. Boy, I'm going on. I'll just stop.
I just read the biography of Charles Manson.
Ooh. Okay.
I'm reading for the first time the unabridged version of The Count of Monte Cristo, which is full of a lot more drugs and violence than the abridged version. So it's fun.
Speaking of reading things, segue, I think these guys probably want to hear you guys read some of your books, little sections of it. But Brandon, you had a question
I have
for them?
a question for the audience. Now, would you like us to read from our own books, or would you like us to swap books and read from one another's? I'll let you raise your hand. You can only vote once. Who wants to see us read from our own? A few of you do. I'm sorry, because it looks like who wants to see us swap? Okay, so we will read from each other's books then. Oh, hi! I didn't even see you guys there. How do you say your last name? My cabbie wanted to know. Yes, no. Yeah. Kalyani. Hi. How do you say your last name?
My last name is Paolini.
Okay. He asked me. He's from India, and I was trying to say it.
So how do we want to do this? Do we want to round robin it?
Yeah. Who do you? Who do you want to read?
You choose. You're the boss.
Yeah.
What?
Why don't we?
We'll
we
just
pass them this
pass
way?
them one direction, and then mine goes down to Christopher. Or do we pass them that way? Which way?
I want to read
Okay,
yours.
you want to read mine. Okay,
There
we'll
you
go
go.
on this way. All right.
Read it with flair, Christopher.
Okay.
Just the first 2 pages.
The first 2 pages. Okay.
Or do you want me to read yours?
Read the first
Brandon,
2
I'm going to
pages.
give this to you. Here,
Yeah.
I'm going to show you what you're going to be reading.
Okay.
You're going to start with this line without further
We
protest.
did a lot of
Okay.
prep for this part.
And you're going to end with wordless thanks in her eyes.
See, we're
Okay.
much more
And the
prone
only
to be
thing that's gonna
silly
throw
with
you
other
is
people's books, so
this.
this will be
Oh
more
yeah,
entertaining.
that's going to be a little hard.
Atragulie un ilion.
I'm going to stop.
Or you
and
can
you're
just
gonna
give it
read
to
that.
me.
Yeah, I'm going to stop and you will pronounce that. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Shall I start then?
Go for it. Man, this is weird.
And don't worry, we're only going to read a couple of pages.
I'm going to sit over here twitching as he reads my work, so don't mind me.
Without further protest, Aragon slipped through the jostling group that surrounded Saphrina. That's what I've said in my head. How do you act?
Saphira.
Saphira. I'm sorry.
Ouch.
Sorry.
Ouch.
No. This
This
is how
is good.
books go.
Yeah.
Do you guys do this? You come up with a way to pronounce it
Sure,
in your
that's
head?
how all of my names and ancient
Like
magical
Cianchin.
words come
yeah,
from.
Cianchin.
Anyone?
Yep.
Cianchin?
Yep.
Yeah.
Saphira.
How do you say Cianchin?
Sean Chan is how Robert Jordan said it.
You know, it's not the sort of Shannara.
Yeah, it's
Terry
sort of
Brooks says
Shannara.
it the sort of Shannara.
Shannara. Ruined my childhood when he told me that.
Without further protest, Aragon slipped through the jostling group that surrounded Saphira and jumped onto her back. Before she could take off, an old woman stepped forward and grasped Aragon's foot with a fierce grip. He tried to pull away, but her hand was like an iron talon around his ankle. He could not break her tenacious hold. The burning gray eyes she fixed on him were surrounded by a lifetime's worth of wrinkles. The skin was folded in long creases down her sunken cheeks. A tattered bundle rested in the crook of her left arm. Frightened, Aragon asked, "What do you want?" The woman tilted her arm, and a cloth fell from the bundle, revealing a baby's face. Hoarse and desperate, she said, "The child has no parents. There is no one to care for her but me, and I am weak. Bless her with your power."
Bless her.
Bless her with your power.
Arjitlam.
Arjitlam.
Silverhand.
Oh, yeah. Bless her with your arm, Arjitlam. Bless her for luck. Aragon looked to Oric for help, but the dwarf only watched with a guarded expression. The small crowd fell silent, waiting for his response. The woman's eyes were still fastened on him. "Bless her, Arjitlam. Bless her," she insisted. Aragon had never blessed anyone. It was not something done lightly, and Agalasia. Yeah, you're getting my head things. This is what's fun about this. As a blessing could easily go awry and prove to be more a curse than a boon, especially if that was spoken with ill intent or lack of conviction. Do I dare take that responsibility, he wondered. Bless her, Arjitlam, bless her. Suddenly decided, he searched for a phrase or expression to use. Nothing came to mind until, inspired, he thought of the ancient language. This would be a true blessing, spoken with words of power by one of power. He bent down and tugged the glove off his right hand. Laying the palm on the babe's brow, he intoned,
Atragulie un ilion, tauther ono un atra ono, skulur fra rauther.
Nice.
I could have done that.
The words left him unexpectedly weak, as if he had used magic. He slowly pulled the glove back on and said to the woman, "That is all I can do for her. If any words have the power to forestall tragedy, it will be those." "Thank you, Arjitlam," she whispered, bowing slightly. She started to cover the baby again, but Saphira snorted and twisted until her head loomed over the child. The woman grew rigid, her breath caught in her chest. Saphira lowered her snout and brushed the baby between the eyes with the tip of her nose, then smoothly lifted away. A gasp ran through the crowd, for on the child's forehead, where Saphira had touched her, was a star-shaped patch of skin as white and silvery as Aragon's.
Gedwe Ignazia.
The woman stared at Saphira with a feverish gaze, wordless thanks in her eyes.
Very nice.
I had forgotten that I was going to be getting myself into that when I agreed to do this.
I was anticipating it.
Yes. Yes, yours is going to be easy.
That was simply beautiful.
Oh.
Yeah, brought tears to my eyes.
Still Heart by Brandon Sanderson. Prologue. Okay. I've seen Steelheart bleed. Awesome opening line. It happened 10 years ago. I was 8. My father and I were at the First Union Bank on Adams Street. We used the old street names back then before the annexation. Is that how you say that? Mm-hmm. The bank was enormous, a single open chamber with white pillars surrounding a tile mosaic floor, broad doors that led deeper into the building. 2 large revolving doors opened onto the street, with a set of conventional doors to the sides. Men and women streamed in and out, as if the room were the heart of some enormous beast, pulsing with the lifeblood of people and cash. It's freaking awesome, dude. I knelt backward on a chair. By the way, I endorsed this book, so I read it.
So did I. I think I got a blurb on the back.
Oh, yeah. I knelt backward on a chair that was too big for me, watching the flow of people. I like to watch people. It's a little creepy. The different shapes of faces, the hairstyles, the clothing, the expressions. Everyone showed so much variety back then. It was exciting. Make sure I say his name right. David? David, turn around, please, my father said. He had a soft voice. I'd never heard it raised, save for that one time at my mother's funeral. Thinking of his agony on that day still makes me shiver. See the character development? Good stuff. I turned around, sullen. We were to the side of the main bank chamber in one of the cubicles where the mortgage men worked. Our cubicle had glass sides, which made it less confining, but it still felt fake. There were little wood-framed pictures of family members on the walls, a cup of cheap candy with a glass lid on the desk, and a vase with faded plastic flowers on the filing cabinet. It was an imitation of a comfortable home, much like the man in front of us wore an imitation of a smile. If we had more collateral, the mortgage man said, showing teeth. Everything I own is on there, my father said, indicating the paper on the desk in front of us. His hands were thick with calluses, his skin tanned from days spent working in the sun. My mother would have winced if she'd seen him go to a fancy appointment like this, wearing his work jeans and an old t-shirt with a comic book character on it. At least he'd combed his hair. It was starting to thin. He didn't care about that as much as other men seemed to. Just means fewer haircuts, Dave, he'd tell me, laughing as he ran his fingers through his wispy hair. I didn't point out that he was wrong. He would still have to get the same number of haircuts, at least until all of his hair fell out. I just don't think I can do anything about this, the mortgage man said. You've been told before. The other man said it would be enough, my father replied, his large hands clasped before him. He looked concerned, very concerned. The mortgage man just continued to smile. He tapped the stack of papers on his desk. The world is a much more dangerous place now, Mr. Charleston. The bank has decided against taking risk. Dangerous? My father asked. Well, you know, the epics.
Probably stop there. Well, The Eye of Mines by James Dashner. Chapter 1, The Coffin?
The Coffin.
Coffin, okay. Chapter 1, The Coffin. Michael spoke against the wind to a girl named Tanya. I know it's water down there, but it might as well be concrete. You'll be flat as a pancake the second you hit. Not the most comforting choice of words when talking to someone who wanted to end her life, but it was certainly the truth. Tanya had just climbed over the railing of the Golden Gate Bridge, cars zooming by on the road, and was leaning back toward the open air, her twitchy hands holding on to a pole wet with mist. Even if somehow Michael could talk her out of jumping, those slippery fingers might just get the job done anyway. and then it'd be lights out. He pictured some poor sap of a fisherman thinking he'd finally caught the big one, only to reel in a nasty surprise. "Stop joking," the trembling girl responded. "It's not a game. Not anymore." Michael was inside the Vertnet, the sleep to people who went in as often as he did. He was used to seeing scared people there, a lot of them. Yet underneath the fear was usually the knowing deep down that no matter what was happening in the sleep, it wasn't real. Not with Tanya. Tanya was different. At least her aura, her computer-simulated counterpart was. Her aura had this bat-crazy look of pure terror on her face, and it suddenly gave Michael chills, made him feel like he was the one hovering over that long drop to death. And Michael wasn't a big fan of death, fake or not. "It is a game, and you know it," he said louder than he'd wanted to. He didn't want to startle her. But a cold wind had sprung up, and it seemed to grab his words and whisk them down to the bay. "Get back over here, and let's talk. We'll both get our experience points, and we can go explore the city, get to know each other, find some crazies to spy on, maybe even hack some free food from the shops. It'll be good times. And when we're done, we'll find you a portal, and you can lift back home. Take a break from the game for a while." "This has nothing to do with lifeblood!" Tanya screamed at him. The wind pulled at her clothes, and her dark hair fanned out behind her like laundry on a line. "Just go away and leave me alone. I don't want your pretty boy face to be the last thing I see." Michael thought of lifeblood deep, the next level, the goal of all goals, where everything was 1,000 times more real, more advanced, more intense. He was 3 years away from earning his way inside, maybe 2. But right then, he needed to talk this dopey girl out of jumping to her date with the fishes, or he'd be sent back to the suburbs for a week, making lifeblood deep that much further away.
Wow.
That was great.
He makes my books sound way better than they are. That's cool.
I want to read more now.
Now we need to get you guys to write each other's series.
No,
You know
thank
what?
you.
My life
No.
is too short to be writing Brandon's books.
That'd be easy. I'll write.
And mine's too
James,
short
they'd
to
be
write
like,
his books.
You can write my 400,000 words, and I'll write your 80s. And
You had one chapter that was, what, 80-some in the last
I did have one chapter
last-
that was.
Wheel of Time?
No, writing short books is actually a lot harder
Yeah.
than you would think. When we look at length, length is not a way to judge quality. The Emperor's Soul, which I wrote, which won a Hugo, which is the kind of like the Academy Awards, that was one of the hardest. It was short, and it was hard to write that short. It's
Well,
hard to be that compact.
The smaller the story, the more you can control every single word.
Yeah.
And the harder, the more, and you put the same amount of energy into it. And the bigger the story, the more wiggle room you have.
So it's hard to write short books.
So just for the record, my books were harder to write than your books.
They'd be harder for me to write.
Before we run out of time here, the folks out here in the audience gave some questions for you guys. Figured since we have only a couple of minutes, we could do a little bit of a speed round through
Right,
it.
we should be quick with our answers.
Yeah.
That's hard for us.
So first one.
No.
we'll see what. Is there a different genre or style you'd like to try?
Science fiction, mystery, romance, horror, historical fiction, comedy, you name it, I want to try it. But I do love sci-fi fantasy.
True horror novel.
I like epic fantasy. I like fantasy and science fiction. You may see me doing more SF, but I don't think I see myself trying anything too far afield. I like the idea of speculative fiction.
I like big books and I cannot lie. But anyway.
This is a response to something that happened here in the panel. Not all English teachers are bad at teaching writing. The key is to motivate you to read. You all have successfully done that. Was there a teacher that inspired any of you?
Yes, the teacher who handed me my first fantasy novel was a fantastic teacher. And she's part of why I'm a writer right now. The thing is, teaching writing is just not, it's hard to do. and I don't know that you can motivate people. You just teaching people how to write. You've got to get them writing yourself, and I think the best teachers motivate you to do it yourself.
You can't teach inspiration.
Yeah, that was what I was trying to say when I say you can't teach writing, or the high school teachers can't teach writing. What I'm trying to say is you need to be reading and writing yourself. The teacher can only do so much. They can inspire you, but they can't teach you to do it. You've got to do it yourself.
For me, it was my parents and my editor, Michelle, and the three of them, and my sister. They all taught me pretty much everything I know about good writing, that and all the reading I did.
Mrs. Becker, AP English, 12th grade. She let me do my senior thesis as a book of limericks.
That's a good teacher.
It was hilarious.
James, you have a huge fan base in Toronto, Ontario. When will you visit us?
I love Toronto. I was there a couple of years ago, and in fact, I've been there twice, so you missed me.
Well, it's my daughter, so she's just gotten into the books.
Okay, she's a new fan.
It's mortally embarrassed right now.
I bet for sure that within a year or two, I'll go back to Toronto, because I want to meet the mayor. Yeah, I better go quick.
Similar question for you. Hey, Christopher Paolini, when will your next book tour have any place in Rochester, New York?
I have been to Rochester before on tours. I'm not sure when I'll be back there, honestly. It's sort of up to the publisher and up to my own speed at writing. Honestly, I spent so much time touring for the Inheritance cycle. I was actually on the road more in 2011 and 2012 than I was at home. And I'm trying to cut down on that just so that I can write a little bit more. So I hope I get to go back there, but if I have to choose between a trip and finishing a book, I'm going to finish the book.
What about Toronto?
Hey, I like Toronto. I've been there a couple of times. It's a great place.
Cool. Mr. Sanderson, pronounce this.
Okay, let me preface by saying, however you say the words in your own head is correct in your version. I'm a big believer in the idea that I write a script and then you direct it. So you may do it, and I actually say some of the names in my books wrong. Because I'm an American and I can't,
I have a horrible Elvish accent.
Right. Like in the Mistborn books, Kelsier, I say his name Kelsier. In World, they'd say Kelsier. Because it's a French pronunciation area. The name you want pronounced is Sazed, is how I say it. You may say it however you wish.
Nancy?
By the way, it's Hermione, not Hermione.
Yeah.
This is, I assume, for Christopher, but hey, we'll open it up to all of you guys. What were the original endings for the Aragon characters that you changed?
Oh boy. If I completely answer that, I'm going to spoil the last book for anyone who hasn't read it. Has anyone not read Inheritance who plans on reading it? Okay, let's just say that characters who lived were going to die, and characters who achieved power were not going to achieve power, and it was all going to go horribly, horribly wrong.
All right. This is an interesting one, but they picked it out of the audience. How do you feel about being labeled inferior to vitriolic readers on Reddit? I guess more, how do you feel about internet reaction to your books?
Hey, if they're excited enough about my work to say bad things about it, I obviously did something right. It's hard to make people hate you, seriously. You know you succeed when someone hates your work, because it doesn't matter who you are as an author, someone doesn't like you. I mean, I could go on the street and find people at random who hate Dickens or hate Jane Austen, who hate Shakespeare. You can't please everyone all the time, or even some of the time. So I try to please myself. I please the readers I trust. Those are my family, my editor, my agent, a few other people. And I don't worry about anyone else. I can't.
It's like what I say about the show Lost, which is one of my favorite of all time. People who hated how it ended after 6 seasons retroactively said they hated the whole show. And I'm like, if a show can make you watch it for 6 seasons and be that passionate about it, it is a success. And sometimes people don't like the way our series end, but it's satisfying. You look on the bright side that you were able to pull those kind of emotions out of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that when you encounter responses like that, you just got to let it bounce off you. I usually go read 1-star reviews of books I love. I'll go look and see what the 1-star reviews of Terry Pratchett novels are, which I think are brilliant. I'm like, if people are disliking Terry Pratchett novels, there's no way I can please everybody, right? Yeah. But it's weird that we get so passionate about it. People on the internet do. It's like that XKCD. Someone's wrong on the internet.
But they are.
Yes, they are. But the thing about it is, when it comes to tastes like this, we get very passionate about it, where in some ways, we aren't. And art is a taste. You are not going to like every piece of art.
Yeah.
No one likes every piece of art. And there are some things that just don't speak to you. A lot of poetry doesn't speak to me. It's a form that just doesn't work. Some does, but most poetry doesn't.
I wrote Aragon when I was 15, 16, and if I had not written it and someone else had written the book and I picked it up now, I might not enjoy it simply because I'm at a different place in my life. I'm not reading a bunch of coming-of-age fantasy anymore. I'm reading things more like The Way of Kings or other things, and that's what appeals to me now. So, all you can do is, do some people enjoy your work? Do they enjoy it enough that you can do what you want to do for a living? All right, you're a success. As Stephen King says, if the check clears, you are a successful writer.
And you can always shoot them the bird emoticon.
Two very specific questions for Brandon. First one, dear Brandon, does time flow the same speed in all of your shard rolls?
Yes, the Cosmere's time flows unless it's being manipulated by an external force. It flows at the same speed. Who asked that question? Right here. Have you gotten one of these yet? What? No?
All right, there we go. And I was just giving, we have to wrap up, but I do have one last question from the audience, which I thought was a good note to end on. What advice would you give for fledgling writers for publishing?
For publishing or for actually writing your first novel? Is the question, is it advice on how to get published or how to just write your first novel?
It's kind of both. I don't know whether or not to do like self-publishing or not.
All right, well, getting self-published nowadays is easier than any other time in history. And if you self-publish a novel and it gets you find an audience, you can get a publishing deal, very easily in one sense. That's happened to a lot of authors. It happened with Wool is the most recent example. That's the route I took. It's a lot of work, I won't lie to you. You have to promote the book, you have to get the word out. And that may not be something you want to do. You may just want to submit to a publisher. Ultimately, what you have to do is write a book that people want to read. If you do that, whether you self-publish or go with a traditional publisher, you will find the audience you want to find.
There is something to say for the vast majority of the self-published authors who get really successful end up going to a traditional publisher.
But I would say Christopher's answer is fantastic on that one. And I think the self-publishing that you can do nowadays is really helping the genre of just books along in general. But I would add the caveat. The most important thing you can do right now is write book 2.
Yeah.
Finish book 1. Choose whether to self-publish or not. Either way is really valid. Look on resources, but get it edited. Have people you trust. Actually, once you finish the book, put it aside for at least 6 months and let other people read it. Come back and do a revision 6 months later when you've had some distance while you've been writing something else. Then release it or send it off, whatever you decide. Both ways are valid, but write another book.
Yeah, you don't mean book 2 in her series. You mean a different book.
It can be book 2 if you want it to. I suggest skipping to something else just to cleanse your palate and try something new. But whatever it is, you need to train yourself to become a writer. Not write one book. You need to train yourself to be someone who can write books.
And I would really emphasize writing every day whether or not you feel inspiration. It's like practicing a musical instrument. Learning everything you can about the language you're writing in, and writing about what you care about the most. If you want to write about singing toasters, go for it. There's almost 7 billion people on the planet. Whatever you're interested in, there is a good chunk of people who are interested in the same sort of things. We like to think we're unique in our interests, but we usually aren't. And I really want to hammer on the editing. The thing is it's like music again. Even the best singers go to voice coaches because they can't sometimes hear when they hit a bad note or when they're a little bit off or when they're putting the emphasis in the wrong places. And that's what editing is for a writer. No matter how good you are, you cannot see the flaws in your own work, or you can't see all of them. So as painful as it is, find someone who's a good reader, who likes the genre you're writing in, and ultimately good editors are good readers, and have them mark up your work. And you don't have to pay attention to every single mark. You don't have to change everything, that they recommend, but at least think about the things they're saying and try to improve, try to do better. I've learned more from editing than I ever have from just writing alone.
All right, we are going to have to wrap up, but before we do, thank you to the 92Y for setting this up. They've been amazing. Also, thank you to everybody at Random House for also setting this up and for publishing these awesome books. And Rebecca from the 92Y is going to come out in a moment to tell those of you who are here physically in New York how to get your book signed. But before we go, a couple of people we want to thank. We want to thank Brandon Sanderson, James Dashner, and Christopher Paolini. All right. Good work.
That was great. Good job.